Hey guys, tonight we drift into a world of jealous gods, golden apples, and the kind of long-term grudge you'd need an emotional support Hydra to manage. Picture this, you're at a divine wedding banquet on Mount Olympus, and everything smells like ambrosia and incense. The gods are lounging around in their finest chitons, sipping nectar, probably side-eyeing each other across the room. It's the kind of party where drama doesn't just happen, it's practically the whole menu. Suddenly, Eris, the goddess of discord, who shockingly didn't make the invite list, barges in like your chaotic cousin showing up unannounced to a wedding. She tosses a golden apple across the banquet table. Inscribed on it are the words, "For the fairest." That's it. That one passive-aggressive fruit triggers one of the longest-running interpersonal feuds in mythological history. Hera's eyes narrow. Aphrodite fluffs her hair. Athena clenches her spear just slightly. You already know this isn't going to end with group therapy. Now, mortals might take the hint and split the prize 3 ways. Maybe post a selfie and move on. But gods, no. They turn to a mortal shepherd-boy-prince hybrid named Paris to settle it. Why him? That's a question historians still argue about. Some say it was fate. Others think the gods just liked messing with Trojans. Either way, Paris is now caught in a divine pageant with cosmic consequences. He's promised power by Athena, domination by Hera, and the world's most beautiful woman by Aphrodite. He picks Aphrodite. Not exactly shocking. And that right there is where Hera officially becomes the queen of the grudge holders. Because if you thought the apple was petty, just wait. Hera doesn't forget. She doesn't forgive. And she absolutely does not move on. You're about to spend the next few thousand years watching her make that one bad decision very, very expensive for just about everyone. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And if you're listening from somewhere warm tonight, leave your city and local time in the comments. I always love seeing where you're tuning in from. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You float gently into the aftermath of the banquet. Hera isn't yelling or cursing or throwing thunderbolts that's Zeus's style. No, she's quiet, regal, dangerous. She smiles thinly and files the betrayal away like a tax auditor memorizing your receipts. She's going to ruin some lives, but she'll do it with ceremony and patience. That's the thing about Hera, she's not a villain in the mustache-twirling sense. She's more like your passive-aggressive aunt who remembers what you said about her potato salad in 2009, and has slowly orchestrated your social downfall, one small, devastating act at a time. And she's got centuries to work with. Some historians argue that the apple myth wasn't originally about Hera at all, that her role was inflated later by poets who loved a good scorned woman angle. Others think it reflects actual shifts in ancient Greek views on marriage, power, and female agency. Either way, in the mythological record we've inherited, Hera is locked into the role of the eternal grudge holder, all because she lost a rigged contest judged by a man who lived in a hut with goats. And like most of Hera's stories, the apple incident isn't isolated. It's the first chapter in a saga of slow-burn vengeance. Hera's the kind of character who doesn't just storm off stage after a fight. She rewrites the whole third act. As you settle further into the pillows, you might wonder why didn't she just go after Paris? Wouldn't that have been simpler? That's the twist. Hera did go after him, just not right away. First, she decided to take down his entire city, his lineage, and anyone who looked vaguely affiliated. Remember, this is a goddess who cursed a baby for being born at the wrong moment. Subtlety is not her problem. Prioritization is. The myth of the Golden Apple became one of the great prequels to the Trojan War, and that's a saga we'll float into later. Don't worry, but tonight, we're just beginning to untangle how one very determined goddess became myth's most committed grudge holder, and why, Even now, people still tell stories not just about what she did, but how long she kept doing it. Because when Hera doesn't get her way, well, you probably wouldn't survive this. You're still drifting in the aftermath of that ill-fated divine beauty pageant, where Hera, despite being queen of the heavens, lost to Aphrodite, a goddess best known for literally embodying love, desire, and the cheekbones of 1,000 bad decisions. And while Athena may have grumbled and moved on to more intellectual pursuits, Hera did not. Hera stewed. Now, you'd think being married to the king of the gods might offer a little comfort. Nope. Not when that husband is Zeus, a thunderbolt-hurling, toga-dropping, shape-shifting pile of godly chaos. And certainly not when he lets Paris hand the fairest title to Aphrodite without so much as a sorry, dear. So here you are, watching Hera in full simmer mode. She doesn't scream. She plots. And the first piece on her game board, Paris himself. You imagine Paris, blissfully unaware, shepherding goats on Mount Ida, probably bragging to his livestock about his recent judging gig. What he doesn't realize is that he's just been stamped with Hera's mental sticky note, wreak havoc here. Eventually, Hera begins by whispering into the politics of Olympus. She plants ideas, plays allies off one another, and nudges Zeus with questions that are technically innocent, but dripping with intent. Darling, have you noticed how often Aphrodite visits the mortal realm lately? She must be so busy. Subtle. Poisonous? Effective? Historians still debate whether the Paris judgment was a later mythic addition, designed to retroactively explain the Trojan War's divine drama. Some versions don't even mention Hera's involvement. Others make her the primary force behind every terrible thing that follows. The truth may never be fully clear, but what's certain is this: once Hera's been insulted, the fallout spans generations. And you, poor sleepy traveler, are floating through the ripples of that golden apple moment as they begin to spread. Hera doesn't act all at once. She's not an instant karma kind of deity. She's the celestial equivalent of someone creating a 5-year revenge spreadsheet. There are tabs. There are pivot tables. Her first real move after the apple political leverage, if she couldn't be crowned the fairest, she'd double down on being the most feared. Temples go up. Priests and priestesses start invoking her with a little extra tremble in their voices. She's not the goddess you pray to enjoy. She's the one you pray to out of sheer respect. You light a candle and whisper, "Please don't notice me." You wander now into a quiet hillside sanctuary, the air thick with burning herbs and the distant sound of bells. A marble statue of Hera towers above the altar, her eyes cold, her expression fixed somewhere between benevolence and judgment. You feel small, the kind of small that makes you want to rethink every questionable choice you've ever made. And across the land, the stories begin. Hera cursing mortals, Hera chasing Zeus's lovers, Hera sending monsters. It's not just about Paris anymore, it's about setting a tone. You don't cross Hera. You don't snub her. You don't offer her second billing at divine ceremonies. She'll remember. A fringe detail most people forget. Hera had her own network. Minor goddesses, demi-goddesses, spirits of vengeance. She didn't operate alone. When she wanted someone followed, watched, or quietly humiliated, she had a full celestial HR department ready to act. A divine intern might not ruin your life, but 10 of them could certainly rearrange your week. And as for Paris, his fate was sealed the moment he chose beauty over power. That choice wouldn't just doom Troy, it would turn Hera into the mythological patron saint of "I told you so," and there's really no coming back from that. You start to understand something. Hera's role in myth is rarely kind, but always fascinating. She's not the goddess of hugs or happy endings. She's the one you watch in the background, calculating, waiting, and eventually, inevitably, acting. In your half-sleep haze, you feel like you're floating past 1,000 altars, each one lit with a prayer that's just a little nervous. Hera looms large, not just in Olympus, but in the cultural consciousness of the Greeks. She's the divine reminder that actions have consequences even for gods, especially for gods. And her first lesson, carved into myth with the slow patience of a deity, denied her do never, ever underestimate a goddess with time on her hands. You're drifting now through the next ripple in this divine slow-burn saga, long past the golden apple, and well into the part where Hera has stopped pretending to play nice. By now, Paris has made his choice, Aphrodite has claimed her prize, and somewhere in the divine equivalent of a group chat, Hera has quietly removed herself and begun organizing her personal vendetta with the precision of a chess master. You might expect her to go after Aphrodite next, and she will eventually, but first, she zeroes in on the mortal consequences of Paris's decision. Specifically, Helen. Yes, that Helen. The face that launched 1,000 ships and a 10-year war. Hera doesn't blame Helen directly. Of course, just as she doesn't blame the apple, she blames the man who threw the match and the system that didn't vote her most beautiful when she clearly brought the strongest resume. And what does she do with all that divine fury? She turns it outward. She starts accumulating receipts. You find yourself now in the great hall of Olympus, somewhere behind the scenes of thunderbolts and ambrosia. Hera is there, sitting perfectly still, her robe draped just so, her crown gleaming like it's been polished with pettiness. She's not yelling. She's just watching. You'd think Zeus might notice, but the king of gods is the definition of emotionally unavailable. He's out there shape-shifting into swans and bulls, completely oblivious to the fact that his wife is brewing a vengeance stew with ingredients collected across dimensions. Hera, it turns out, doesn't limit her resentment to Aphrodite or Paris. She has a history, and you're about to stroll through it. Let's start with Io. Poor, unfortunate Io, a mortal priestess of Hera, of all things. She catches the attention of Zeus, which is basically the beginning of the end for anyone. Zeus, in his usual subtle style, seduces her. Hera, catching wind of the tryst, doesn't rage at her husband. Of course not. That would be direct. Instead, she turns her gaze on Io. In a move that says more about her creativity than her mercy, Hera transforms Io into a white cow, a literal cow, but not a safe one. Hera assigns Argus Panoptes, a creature with 100 eyes, to guard her new bovine rival. You imagine being followed around by a giant whose entire job is to make sure you stay a cow? It's not ideal. Here's the quirky tidbit. Argus, in some versions, wasn't just a guard he was entertained by watching Cow Io swat flies. That was his pastime. There are worse ways to pass eternity, but it doesn't exactly scream divine purpose. Now, Zeus eventually sends Hermes to rescue Io, and Hermes, in a rare display of subtlety, lulls Argus to sleep with music and kills him. Hera, instead of getting mad, plucks all of Argus's eyes and puts them on the tail of a peacock. That's right, the next time you see a peacock fan out its tail, you're looking at a godly memento of a petty surveillance system. This bit of myth serves two purposes. First, it gives Hera a flashy bird mascot. Second, it reminds everyone that when she loses a round, she still claims the prize. Historians still argue whether the story of Io is meant to symbolize the oppression of women by divine patriarchy, or simply the cautionary tale of don't be attractive around Zeus. Either way, Hera walks away from that one with a cow, a murdered 100-eyed giant, and a shiny new symbol, efficient. As you float along, the pattern becomes clear. Hera doesn't just punish, she makes it memorable. She turns misfortunes into monuments, whether it's a peacock tail or a cursed family line. Her revenge is always curated. And the deeper you go into the myths, the more you realize it's not just about Paris, not even just about Zeus. Hera's fury spans time and bloodlines. Anyone caught in her husband's orbit becomes a potential target. And while her methods vary, the message never does. I saw what you did. I'm not going to yell. I'm just going to change your life forever, and not in a good way. You begin to feel the slow, sleepy weight of that realization settle over you like a heavy velvet curtain. That's Hera's real power, not lightning or fire or dramatic outbursts, but the slow erosion of peace. She doesn't explode, she lingers. And as you start to drift off a little more deeply, you remember this is only the beginning of her many long-standing grudges. You haven't even gotten to the talking echoes, cursed lovers, or snakes yet. Hera still has a lot of story to tell. You're drifting deeper into the myths now, past the famous names and into the shadowy corners where Hera's grudges settle like sediment. By now, you've seen her reaction to the golden apple and poor Io's cow-shaped fate. But if you think that was petty, oh, you haven't even scratched the surface. Hera doesn't just go after mistresses and mortals. Sometimes, she files emotional grievances against entire bloodlines. You're floating straight into her long, starched history of divine micromanagement. Tonight, your dreamscape takes you into Hera's reputation-building era. She's not just a goddess with a temper anymore. She's the official queen of the gods. Her throne, you imagine, gleams with carved peacocks and ivory, always just a bit higher than the others. Not because she needs to see better, but because it's symbolic, and symbols matter when you're eternally slighted. You land softly beside another of Hera's cases, the story of Echo. It begins innocently enough. Echo is a nymph, lovely voice, social butterfly, always chatting. One day, Hera, in the middle of tracking down yet another of Zeus's wandering whims, hears chatter, lots of it. Echo, sensing trouble, steps in and distracts the goddess with endless small talk. Classic damage control. Unfortunately, it works a little too well. By the time Hera realizes she's been played, Zeus has already left the scene. Hera's reaction. Predictable? Surgical? She curses Echo to never speak first again, only to repeat the last words others say. You can imagine Echo, blinking in confusion, trying to say hello, and instead being forced to echo hello back at someone who already said it. A frustrating loop, and poetic, in the way all of Hera's curses tend to be. Historians still argue whether Echo's tale originated as a standalone moral fable or was later folded into Hera's expanding grudge resume. Either way, Hera's touch is all over it. A talking punishment, efficient, elegant, no bloodshed necessary. You trail softly onward through other similar punishments, dozens of them, each delivered with the kind of restraint that makes them feel colder. Somehow, she doesn't punish with chaos, she punishes with logic. You lied to me. Now you can't speak your truth again. Forever. Next case. Take Semeles, for instance. Another mortal who caught Zeus's eye, which by now is practically a job hazard. Semele, sweet, mortal, and utterly doomed, gets pregnant by Zeus. Hera, not exactly in the mood to send a baby shower, shows up in disguise. Just a nice old woman, friendly, curious. She quietly plants the seed of doubt in Semele's mind. How do you really know it's Zeus? She whispers. Wouldn't a real god reveal himself in all his glory? Of course, this leads Semele to make the worst wish in mythology. She asks Zeus to show himself in his full divine form. And because he promised never to refuse her a request, he does, and she dies. Instantly. Mortal bodies, it turns out, are not meant to gaze directly upon lightning-charged cosmic husbands. But here's the quirky bit. Their unborn child survives. Kind of. Baby Dionysus is rescued, stitched into Zeus's thigh, and later reborn. Yes, thigh birth. Because Greek mythology is deeply weird, and nobody ever asked, is this anatomically reasonable? Still, Hera tries again to wipe him out. Repeatedly, Dionysus, the future god of wine and hangovers, spends much of his youth on the run, driven mad, disguised, and raised in distant lands all thanks to Hera's long memory and longer reach. You settle into the warmth of this pattern. It's soothing, in a way, predictable. Someone wrongs Hera intentionally or not, and she delivers judgment with the precision of a librarian shelving overdue books. The charges vary. The consequences linger forever. You pass by the quiet temple walls now, imagining her statues, always regal, sometimes serene, occasionally armed with a scepter and a look that says, "I know what you did, and I've already drafted the punishment." People didn't just worship Hera, they respected her, feared her, and why wouldn't they? She was the divine embodiment of consequence. It's important to remember this wasn't seen as overreaction in ancient Greece. This was justice, divine justice. Hera wasn't petty, she was principled. At least, that's what her cults believed. Cities like Argos and Samos built towering shrines in her honor, filled with offerings. Marriages were made under her watch. Vows were whispered into the air with fingers crossed that she was listening favorably. And maybe, on quiet nights like this, she did listen. Maybe she still does. Now you're gliding down a quiet, marble corridor somewhere in Olympus, past columns wrapped in ivy and the soft echo of sandals on stone. Somewhere far above, the stars wheel slowly through an inky sky. And down below on Earth, the gods are once again interfering with human lives, and Hera is taking notes. You find yourself drifting beside a bronze cradle. Inside it, a baby coos strong for his age, eyes bright, fists already clenched as if ready to fight lions. You already know who this is. Hercules, or Heracles, as the Greeks actually called him. Glory of Hera, a deeply ironic name for a child she tried to murder with snakes. Let's back up. Zeus, as ever, had an affair this time with a mortal woman named Alcmene. Hera, upon hearing of the birth, doesn't wait to exact revenge. She sends 2 serpents into the nursery while the baby is still swaddled in a sleep haze. Most infants might scream or choke. Hercules grabs the snakes by the neck and strangles them before breakfast. And Hera doesn't give up. If anything, she escalates. Historians still debate whether the entire 12 labors of Hercules were punishment from Hera or a redemption arc designed by Zeus. Either way, Hera makes sure those labors are less community service and more death trap crossed with endurance sport. Every trial is touched by her hand. When Hercules must clean the Augean stables in a single day, it's Hera who makes sure the stench is mythologically foul. When he fights the Hydra, guess who made sure it had heads that regenerate? That's right, Queen Grudge herself. You begin to understand something about Hera's psychology. She doesn't believe in half measures. If you're going to be a threat to her pride, whether by existing, succeeding, or simply being Zeus's favorite, you're going to earn every breath you take. Now imagine Hercules growing up under this weight, a demigod, yes, but also a walking reminder of Hera's deepest humiliation. The gods aren't just metaphors in these stories, they're personalities. Hera's is a swirling cocktail of injured pride, divine protocol, and very long-term memory. Here's a little-known tidbit. Hera once tricked Zeus into swearing that a child born of his bloodline that day would be king. She delayed Alcmene's labor and sped up the birth of another child, Eurystheus, so that he would take the throne instead of Hercules. That's not just interference, that's obstetric warfare. You hover now in the hazy morning light of myth, watching Hercules grow into his strength. But behind every triumph, you see Hera, tightening screws, adjusting obstacles, reminding everyone that power comes at a price. When Hercules goes mad and kills his own family, yes, another gift from Hera. It isn't just tragedy, it's administration. Hera makes sure no loose ends go unpunished. Still, despite everything, Hercules becomes a hero. A big one. And you can imagine Hera watching all of this unfold like a parent realizing their child has actually done something impressive. except the child isn't hers, and the thing he's done involved surviving everything she threw at him. In the end, spoiler alert, Hera even lets Hercules join Olympus. After death, after a lifetime of suffering, she curated. He gets promoted. She even allows him to marry her daughter Hebe, the goddess of youth. And you wonder, is that forgiveness? Or just Hera folding the paperwork and shelving the file? Some scholars argue that this final act shows Hera's complexity, that she can be cruel, yes, but also capable of closure. Others think it's simply easier to absorb a threat than continue fighting it. You don't defeat a rival, you make them family. Either way, Hercules ends up immortal, sipping nectar at family reunions beside the goddess who once tried to crush him with his own cradle toys. You float gently through that paradox, wrapped in it like a soft wool blanket. Hera, both destroyer and stepmother, enemy and eventual ally. The story of Hercules is really two stories: the man who overcomes impossible tasks, and the goddess who made sure those tasks were impossible in the first place. And Hera, she never apologizes. She just moves on to the next case. By now, you're used to the rhythm. Hera sees a threat, real or imagined, and responds not with thunder or spectacle, but with method. And tonight, as you drift onward through this soft focus history of divine grievances, you land beside a story so short and strange, it almost feels like a footnote. But, oh, what a revealing little footnote it is. You're hovering just above a spring garden on Mount Olympus, the air thick with the scent of wild thyme and early figs. The sun is gentle here. Birds wheel lazily overhead, and there, under a flowering branch, you spot a small, fluffy, slightly ridiculous creature, a cuckoo bird. Yes, a cuckoo, tiny, inconspicuous, the least threatening of birds. And yet, this is the moment when Hera, goddess of storms and marriage, gets tricked into marriage herself. The story goes like this: Zeus, being Zeus, had tried to woo Hera and failed, multiple times. So he shapeshifted, because of course he did, into a helpless little cuckoo, perched shivering in the cold rain. When Hera saw it, compassion stirred. She tucked the poor creature into her robes to warm it. Boom, instant Zeus. Not exactly the most romantic beginning, but it worked. Hera agreed to marry him, and they became king and queen of Olympus, a marriage that would define eternity, and also most of Hera's future stress levels. Historians still argue whether this tale was meant to be comic relief or a symbolic lesson about nature tricking even the highest powers. But one thing's certain, it shows us how deeply mythology leaned into irony. The Queen of Heaven, master of decorum and order, was won over by a damp bird. And so, their marriage began already layered in deception. Hera would spend centuries navigating the consequences of that decision. You start to see how much of her mythological resentment wasn't just about betrayal, it was about never truly having had a choice in the first place. This one little detail, Zeus as cuckoo, might seem absurd, even whimsical, but in it lies the seed of Hera's whole narrative. A woman outmaneuvered, a goddess whose strength is taken for granted, a partner whose fidelity is repaid with flirtations, affairs, and chaos. No wonder she keeps score. You float now through the early years of their divine marriage. Olympus is just getting organized. The gods are carving out roles, building temples, establishing rules. Hera is the matron of marriage, childbirth, and queenship. She is the face on wedding rituals, the name whispered during labor. She stands for loyalty, for structure, for devotion. And yet, the stories told about her are filled with bitterness and sabotage. Why? Because her own marriage is a disaster zone. It's as if the ancient Greeks looked at the messiness of human unions and projected them skyward, wrapping up all their anxieties into one eternally betrayed goddess. Here's a quirky cultural tidbit in some ancient Greek city festivals. Brides would symbolically argue with statues of Hera before marriage, as if bracing themselves for the challenges to come. A little passive-aggressive, sure, but revealing. Hera, you begin to realize, is the ultimate cautionary tale. Not because she's jealous, but because she's expected to embody loyalty in a world that never returns it. She's the standard bearer for a system designed to break hearts and then blamed when she doesn't take it quietly. So when she lashes out at Zeus's lovers, their children, innocent bystanders, it's not random. It's ritual. It's how she reclaims control in a world that constantly undercuts her. Tonight, you're walking the line between myth and metaphor. Hera isn't just a character. She's a mood, a sharp inhale, the unspoken "I told you so" echoing through generations of stories. She's both the law and the lawyer. And no matter how absurd the method, whether it's bird-based seduction or thunderous retribution, she never ever forgets the original slight. You curl deeper into the covers, imagining that cuckoo bird again, shivering, soft, harmless, until it wasn't. You're floating now through the next layer of Hera's long memory, deeper into the folds of her grievances, this time against a woman named Leto. And unlike some of Hera's other targets, Leto isn't a flirty nymph or a manipulative schemer. No, Leto is soft-spoken, low-profile, and very, very pregnant. Which, of course, makes her a target. You drift across a dry plain under a blazing ancient sun. The ground is cracked, the air heavy. Leto is wandering, one hand on her belly, the other shielding her eyes from the light. She's carrying twins, children of Zeus, and trying desperately to find a place to give birth, a task that, under normal circumstances, would be a private, sacred moment, but Hera has other ideas. She's issued a divine decree: no land under the sun shall offer Leto refuge. No island, no nation, no inch of earth is allowed to provide a bed, a mat, or even a shadow. And so Leto walks. Days blur. Her sandals wear thin. Her back aches. You can feel the exhaustion through myth itself. A fatigue soaked into every version of this tale. Here's where the fringe detail emerges. The land that finally takes pity on Leto is Delos, a floating island, unanchored, technically not bound to the earth, a loophole. Historians still debate whether Delos was originally a free-floating reef or a literary invention, but in myth, it's the legal technicality that allows Leto to rest. And so, on a trembling patch of land that barely counts, Leto finally collapses and gives birth first to Artemis, the huntress, who, according to some versions, immediately turns around and midwifes her twin brother Apollo. Yes, moments after birth, Artemis is already working. That's Greek mythology for you no maternity leave in Olympus. You now drift gently into that quiet moment, Leto panting, the ocean lapping at the shore, the cries of newborn gods echoing softly into the dawn. A sliver of peace, a victory not over Hera, but through resilience. But Hera doesn't stop there. She delays Eileithyia, goddess of childbirth, from arriving to assist Leto. In some versions, Hera physically restrains her, just to make sure labor lasts as long as mythologically possible. Only after bribery, usually a necklace or a token gift, does the childbirth goddess finally show up and allow the twins to be born. That's Hera, always working the margins. The story of Leto highlights one of Hera's more unsettling talents, punishing people for things they can't control. Leto didn't seduce Zeus, she didn't scheme or lie, she simply existed, and in Hera's eyes, that's enough. You find yourself standing now in the cool interior of a temple to Leto. Soft light filters through stone slats, and offerings of flowers and honey cakes sit quietly at her feet. You notice that worship of Leto often centers on endurance. She became a symbol of strength, not in battle, but in bearing suffering. Scholars still argue whether Leto's myth was meant to soften Hera's image by portraying her as a test of worthiness rather than outright villain. Others suggest it was a warning: align yourself with the wrong power, and even the earth will turn you away. But for you, it's something simpler. Leto's story is Hera in miniature, a godly bureaucracy, a denial of comfort, a world where justice doesn't always mean kindness. Even after the birth, Hera keeps a watchful eye on the twins, Apollo especially. The sun god will grow into one of Olympus's brightest stars, something Hera both respects and resents. And Artemis, fierce and independent, carries the memory of her mother's suffering like a badge. As you breathe in, you can almost hear Hera in the distance, her voice soft, polished, and cold. She doesn't shout, she doesn't curse. She simply ensures that suffering finds the right address. And you, still nestled in your blanket cocoon, drift deeper into the myth, not with fear, but with understanding. Hera's not chaos. She's consequence. She's the rule that doesn't bend, the judgment that arrives slowly, like nightfall, wrapping everything in shadow. You're adrift now in the cool evening that follows the birth on Delos, but Hera's vengeance doesn't fade with the sunset. If anything, it sharpens, because now there are two new immortals on the playing field, Apollo and Artemis, and though they're divine, they arrive into a world already colored by their mother's suffering, and Hera, still seated high upon her throne of celestial protocol and deep offense, is far from done. Tonight, you'll follow those twins just for a little while and watch how Hera's grudges wrap their fingers not just around lovers or mothers, but around the very children of Olympus. The first thing you notice about Artemis and Apollo is how fast they grow. Blink, and they're teenagers. Divine teenagers, which means they come fully loaded with God-level ambition and zero tolerance for disrespect. Apollo picks up a lyre and a bow and immediately starts winning contests. Artemis claims the wilderness and starts recruiting nymphs into her personal No Boys Allowed hunting collective. They're formidable, fierce, and thanks to Hera's early meddling, forged in the fire of maternal exile. Now, Hera can't quite strike them directly. Not easily, anyway. They're too high profile, too beloved by the other gods. But what she can do, and often does, is make their lives difficult from the sidelines, especially Apollo's. His pride becomes a convenient weakness, one she nudges gently through the chessboard of fate. Here's a lesser-known myth when Apollo kills the monstrous python. Yes, the enormous earth serpent that guarded the oracle at Delphi. He's not exactly celebrated. Hera sees to that. She ensures he must be cleansed, ritually purified, sent into penance before he can truly assume his new role. That's how it works in Hera's world. Even justified victories come with paperwork. You float beside Apollo now as he approaches the oracle for the first time, head bowed, harp slung across his back. Delphi becomes his sacred site, but only after negotiation, debt, and delay. It's never simple when Hera's involved. Meanwhile, Artemis forges her own legacy, running wild through forests, crowned in moonlight, swift and untouchable. But even she is shadowed by her mother's legacy. She demands oaths of chastity from her followers, fiercely protects her domain, and shows mercy only when it suits her carefully built code. There's a theory still debated in quiet university halls and dusty manuscripts that Artemis's obsession with control and Apollo's compulsive order come not from themselves, but from being born into Hera's disapproval, that their very divinity is shaped by that long, punishing walk across a sun-scorched land. And here's the quirky side note. Delos, the floating island, eventually becomes anchored fixed by chains forged by Poseidon himself. So the Temple of Apollo could be stable. A metaphor, perhaps, for children forced to root themselves in a world that never wanted them anchored in the first place. You meander further down these trails of myth, through glades and marble columns, feeling the distance between Hera and the younger gods stretch taut. She becomes the figure they orbit around, whether they love her, fear her, or try to avoid her entirely. She is Olympus's gravitational pull, the center of laws, rituals, and consequences. And yet, you can't help but wonder, does she ever soften? There are rare stories, obscure ones, where Hera shows favor, where she supports a marriage, blesses a birth, or allows a festival to proceed without divine sabotage. These moments are rare, like soft moss among jagged stone. But they exist, enough to suggest that even the stormiest goddess has her quieter moods. You breathe that in, the complexity, the weight of her character. Hera is not simply angry, she is layered, built from centuries of prayer, fear, praise, and projection. The Greeks made her in their image flawed, regal, wounded, indignant. They gave her 1,000 faces and then complained that she frowned too often. And still, she endures. You drift now past her temple on Samos, one of her most ancient sanctuaries. The night air smells of laurel and olive smoke. Her statue stands tall, not snarling, not raging, just watching. She doesn't move. She doesn't need to. Her myth moves for her. And in that stillness, you understand Hera is not about action. She's about inevitability. You break the rules. You pay. Eventually. Silently. Thoroughly. You're gliding now along the borderlands of myth and memory, where mortals brush shoulders with gods, and where even trying to help a divine birth can get you cursed for eternity. The air grows still, the stories tighten. And into this sleepy tapestry walks a king, a clever man named Sisyphus, who, in a move both noble and predictably disastrous, tries to help Leto. Yes, that's Sisyphus, the one you probably remember as the guy eternally rolling a boulder uphill, but before he was poster child for pointless labor, he was just a mortal king who made the mistake of being observant, and a bit too helpful. It's said that when Hera was still hunting down Leto during her exile, Sisyphus noticed. He may have even tipped off Zeus, or simply gave Leto safe passage. Accounts vary. Historians still argue whether he did it out of compassion, strategy, or some overly optimistic sense of moral duty. Regardless, Hera noticed. And Hera doesn't care for moral nuance. You hover now in Sisyphus's once proud city of Ephyra, where his name was once respected. He ruled cleverly, even outwitting death literally on more than one occasion. But Hera, ever patient, ever watching, ensured that cleverness would become his undoing. The story of his punishment is tangled with many gods, Thanatos, Hades, Hermes, but Hera's involvement is always there in the margins. The disapproval, the trigger, the celestial paperwork that lands his name on the divine blacklist. Sisyphus is eventually sentenced to the most exhausting of punishments, rolling a massive boulder up a hill, only for it to slip from his grasp just before the top forever. Not painful, not bloody, just maddening, pointless. The ultimate metaphor for a life spent being a little too clever in a world ruled by grudges. You can almost hear Hera's voice now, just a whisper at the edge of Olympus. You should have minded your own business. But Hera's talent wasn't just in punishing individuals, it was in weaving her will into the fabric of stories. People learn through repetition, and Hera ensured that each myth with her name etched into it carried a moral, or at least, a warning. You drift now past an entire gallery of mortals who learned that lesson the hard way. There's Tiresias, the poor man who saw two snakes mating, got transformed into a woman for years, then switched back, only to get caught between Hera and Zeus in an argument over which gender enjoys pleasure more. He said, "Women do." Zeus agreed. Hera did not. Result, Tiresias is blinded. A fringe version says she struck him not out of offense, but because no mortal should possess divine knowledge. That's the kind of technicality Hera thrives on. Even when she's not initiating the punishment herself, her name haunts the edges of consequence. She's the goddess of due process, in a way of karmic cleanup. You don't need to see her throw the punch. You just find yourself waking up with your fate rearranged and a faint scent of peacock feathers in the air. You settle now beside a quiet mortal campfire. A traveler stares into the flames, recounting Hera's deeds to a child. The tone isn't fearful, it's respectful, even admiring. That's the complexity of Hera. She's not loved for her warmth. She's honored for her presence, for her consistency, for the way she embodies structure in a world of divine chaos. Scholars often note that Hera's myths are about boundaries, who crosses them, who maintains them, and who suffers when they blur. She is not randomness. She is response. You don't always agree with her reaction, but you understand it. And perhaps, Hera would say, that's enough. You float onward now, away from the king with the cursed boulder, from the traveler with the tale. Hera remains still, centered, unmoved. Like gravity itself, she doesn't rage, doesn't dance, doesn't charm. She pulls, she waits, she ensures. You're floating now above the wide plains of mythic memory, the dust of war not yet stirred, but the air already heavy with tension. Because Hera, still brooding over that apple, still counting the unbroken string of slights and snubs, is ready to shift from personal grudges to geopolitical catastrophe. And who better to focus that divine frustration on than a child of Zeus who never asked to be born? Tonight, you drift beside the cradle of Hercules, or Heracles, as the Greeks properly called him, though in this tale, his name might as well be mistake number 372 in Hera's eternal ledger. You've already seen the snakes she sent crawling across his crib, already felt the tension in her narrowed gaze when she looked down upon this child, her husband's child with another woman, Alcmene. But Hera's fury didn't stop at a failed assassination attempt. If anything, it sharpened. And so begins the long, slow march of the 12 labors. You walk beside Hercules now, a full-grown man, muscles rippling, brow furrowed not with confusion, but exhaustion. His life has been nothing but Herculean. That's not a metaphor. That's his whole personality. Why? Because Hera made sure he never had the chance to be anything else. She starts small, madness, a mind unraveling. One day, Hercules wakes to find he has killed his own wife and children. In most versions of the myth, it's Hera's doing, planting madness like a weed in the softest part of his brain. And afterward, when the horror settles in, she doesn't strike again. She lets guilt finish the job. The Oracle of Delphi, perhaps under divine pressure or just a flair for dramatic punishments, tells Hercules he must serve King Eurystheus and complete a series of impossible labors to atone. And guess who helped engineer that very situation? Hera? Of course. Each labor is a quiet little trap. Clean the Augean stables in one day. Slay the Nemean lion. Capture the Ceryneian hind. Tasks designed not just to test strength, but to humiliate, to exhaust, to erode the soul, one impossible assignment at a time. Historians still argue whether these labors were symbolic rites of passage, moral trials, or just the ancient Greek equivalent of PR damage control for a hero with a history of violence. But Hera's fingerprints are all over them. Even when she's not throwing the punch, she's handing someone else the brass knuckles. One particularly bitter labor, the Lernaean Hydra. Hercules lops off a head, two more grow back. It's Hera who nurtures the beast, raises it near her own sacred grove. And when Hercules finally triumphs, it's not with brawn, but with cleverness, cauterizing each neck with fire. Hera doesn't stop him. Not exactly, but she ensures there's no glory without suffering. You trail Hercules through each brutal test, watching as he drags himself toward redemption that always seems just out of reach. And Hera watches too from high above, from temple walls, from the silence between thunderclaps. She doesn't need to interfere constantly. Her initial momentum is enough. Her genius lies in setting a punishment in motion and then stepping back, letting the story unwind like a ball of divine twine. Here's a quirky footnote. When Hercules dies burned alive on a funeral pyre, he builds himself. He doesn't go to the underworld. Zeus, in a final act of fatherly guilt, lifts him to Olympus, immortality, and Hera. She lets him in, even allows him to marry her daughter, Hebe. You blink, wait after all that. Some say it was a truce, others say it was strategy. Keep your enemies close, your stepchildren even closer. But maybe, just maybe, Hera had simply worn herself out, or perhaps it was a gesture so cold and formal that it counted as both forgiveness and warning. You may sit at my table, but never forget who owns the feast. You can feel the weight of it now, this endless loop of rivalry and revenge, ritual and consequence. Hera isn't unpredictable. She's inevitable, a system, a storm with paperwork. And as you drift from the image of Hercules exhausted, ascended, wed into the very family that made him suffer, you finally begin to sense the true scale of Hera's myth. It isn't just about a jealous wife. It's about what happens when power meets pride, and neither one blinks. And Hera never blinks. You find yourself gliding into the next phase of Hera's ongoing campaign against peace and predictability, settling beside the dust-streaked sandals of a man on a mission, Hercules again, stumbling through yet another one of his famous labors. But tonight, you're not following him into the lion's den or the swamp of monsters. No, this time, the challenge is strangely domestic. The task cleaning out the Augean stables. Yes, stables. And not just any stables, these ones haven't been cleaned in decades. They house thousands of divine cattle, and the floor has, shall we say, a thick patina. Mountains of muck, rivers of waste, the kind of task that makes you question your life choices, even if you're a demigod. And yes, Hera had a hand in this one too. Hercules is told to clean it all in one day, no tools, no help, just him, a shovel, and the oppressive smell of divine manure. Now, of course, he doesn't do it with elbow grease. He does it by rerouting 2 nearby rivers. Classic brute force problem solving. But then, surprise King Eurystheus, who acts like Hera's mortal intern, declares the labor invalid. Why? Because Hercules took payment for the job. Technically true, and technically a loophole Hera made sure someone would exploit. This is Hera's game in miniature: set up impossible standards, then disqualify you for being clever. She's not here for fairness. She's here for consequences. And she's very, very good at waiting for just the right moment to declare you've failed. You float past a stunned Hercules, standing in the wet mud, surrounded by squeaky clean cows, and still somehow losing the point. The humiliation doesn't end with monsters. It gets baked into everyday tasks. That's the real torment. And this isn't the only time Hera dips into petty sabotage. Another labor takes Hercules to the far-off land of the Stymphalian birds, metal-beaked monstrosities that shriek and dive and could probably ruin your vacation picnic in one chaotic swoop. Hercules isn't even sure how to start. And again, Hera's there not in the fight, but in the mechanics. The gods gave him a rattle made by Hephaestus. Shake it, scare the birds. Fine. But the birds don't leave, they just scatter. Labor completed debatable. Hera makes sure the judgment comes down to a shrug and a sigh. Historians still argue whether the 12 labors were meant to reflect the stations of a religious ritual, political metaphor, or simply the world's oldest to-do list from hell. What's consistent is that Hera's presence warps each one, twisting the terms, stacking the deck. And here's a fringe bit. Most people forget Hercules wasn't Hera's only victim among Zeus's love children, but he was her longest project. She didn't just try to destroy him. She curated his suffering, like an artisan of affliction. You drift beside a still moment now, Hercules camped by a river. His knuckles raw, his eyes unfocused. There's no monster on the horizon, no dramatic task looming, just quiet. And you realize the quiet may be the worst part, because Hercules knows Hera is still out there, watching, waiting to redefine the rules again. Peacocks scream in the distance sharp, eerie cries that don't sound like birds so much as laughter disguised as song. Hera's birds, always present, always symbolic, the eyes of Argus, her 100-eyed watchman, scattered across those tales like trophies. You pass by a little-known legend that Hera once sent a crab. Yes, a crab to distract Hercules during his battle with the Hydra. The crab bit his foot. Hercules squashed it. Hera, moved by its loyalty, placed it in the stars as the constellation Cancer. That's right, a minor interruption, a footnote in a larger myth, and still, Hera immortalizes it. She doesn't reward victory, she rewards devotion, even if it's crustacean. That's the flavor of her myth. Not storm and fire, but detail, rules, quiet reshaping of the narrative. You didn't win. You only survived. And survival doesn't mean she's finished with you. As you drift farther from Hercules and his cow-stained sandals, you begin to understand that Hera's revenge was never really about destruction. It was about interference. Not ending your story, but bending it, making sure you never forget who really holds the pen. And Hera, she never lets you forget. You drift now into a different kind of myth, not a grand labor or a devastating curse, but something lighter, almost ridiculous. A moment of divine mischief that feels like comic relief in a drama that's otherwise full of betrayal and celestial grudges. And yet, even here, Hera's influence lingers. Tonight, you find yourself floating through the clouds, up near Olympus, where a breeze rustles through immortal robes and the scent of ambrosia mingles with the ozone of distant thunderbolts. And fluttering through the sky, yes, it's that cuckoo again. Or rather, it's a bird playing a very unusual role in one of the more bizarre myths involving Hera. Because sometimes, the Queen of Heaven uses weapons that are feathery, unexpected, and kind of silly. Let's talk about the time she used a cuckoo bird to get revenge. Wait again. Yes, but this time, not as a disguise for Zeus. This time, it's Hera's turn to weaponize bird behavior. In a minor, half-forgotten myth fragment, she sends a cuckoo to distract or torment someone, not to seduce, not to trick, but just to get under their skin. The target may have been a mortal prince, a disrespectful priest, or maybe even Zeus himself. Sources differ wildly. Historians still argue whether this tale is real myth or just ancient comedy. But the image endures. Hera, sending a tiny, fluttering agent of nuisance, a bird that lays its eggs in other nests, causing chaos in miniature. It's like divine trolling, subtle and irritating. And you can't help but admire it, all-powerful. And she chooses a bird. This is one of Hera's lesser-known techniques, distraction. You drift through the mythic airspace of Olympus, passing gods deep in argument or leisure. Hera doesn't need to shout here. She just alters the atmosphere. Maybe a whisper here, a suggestion there, a dream planted, a messenger sent. Sometimes it's a storm. Sometimes it's just an awkward silence at the banquet table that makes everyone shift uncomfortably. She specializes in setting the mood. And that brings you to another curious moment, the story of Ixion. Ixion was a mortal king who got way too comfortable among the gods. So comfortable, in fact, that he developed let's call it an inappropriate admiration for Hera. A big mistake. But instead of smiting him on the spot, Hera plays along. Sort of. She informs Zeus. Zeus, amused in the worst possible way, creates a cloud shaped exactly like Hera and lets Ixion act on his deluded affections. It's weird. It's ancient. It's unsettling. And Hera, she lets it happen, then ensures that Ixion is punished not just by death, but by eternal torment strapped to a flaming wheel that spins forever. Because when you even think of crossing Hera in that way, the punishment must be both ironic and dizzying. That's how Hera operates. Her justice is never random. It's theatrical, fitting, symbolic in a way that almost dares future mortals to think twice. You pass through one of her temples now, not the grand stone edifices of Argos or Samos, but a smaller shrine tucked on a hillside. Offerings lie at her feet, small tokens carved birds, strands of hair from wedding ceremonies, and once, according to fringe records, a tiny clay cuckoo. Even her symbols reflect contradiction. The cuckoo, the lion, the cow, the peacock, softness and strength, seduction and surveillance. She's not a goddess you define in a single icon. She's a full pantheon of feelings, fused into one presence. You slow now, feeling the stories swirl around you like mist. Hera isn't always angry. Sometimes she's amused. Sometimes she plays tricks, but always with an edge, always with a purpose. She doesn't do chaos for chaos's sake. That's more Dionysus's brand. Hera prefers order with just enough disruption to make the point stick. As you begin to drift toward your next mythic waypoint, the wind carries a soft coo, faint, persistent, the sound of a cuckoo echoing through time, reminding you that even the smallest gesture can carry divine weight when it comes from Hera. Now you're drifting back toward Earth, away from cuckoo birds and divine distractions into the dry, cracked lands of ancient Anatolia, where another one of Hera's grudges is slowly unfolding. You don't see her at first, but you can feel her in the air. The pressure behind the clouds. The tension that makes even the trees hold their breath. The target this time, Leto, again. But also her children, now grown Artemis and Apollo. And more precisely, a woman named Niobe. Niobe was a queen, proud, regal, and, in hindsight, deeply unwise. One day, perhaps at a public festival, perhaps in a royal hall, thick with incense and drama, Niobe boasts not just a little, but extravagantly. She has many children. She declares, some say 12, others 14. The number shifts, as myths tend to do. But the key is this more than 2. And unlike Leto, she says poor, pitiful Leto, with her mere twins, I am the true mother to be worshipped. You feel it, don't you? That pause in the air. That moment when the music stops playing. Because saying something like that, out loud, in a world where gods hold grudges for millennia. It's not just foolish, it's practically an invitation. Leto doesn't need to act directly. She has children now, divine archers, each born under duress, each trained in quiet vengeance. So Artemis and Apollo do what immortal twins do best: they descend. One by one, they strike down Niobe's children. Not in battle, not in defense, in cold, clean precision, arrow after arrow, until the palace is silent. Some say one child survives, usually a daughter. Some say all are slain. Either way, Niobe is left broken. She flees. Grief swallows her. And in the end, she turns to stone literally, a cliffside rock face, frozen mid-weeping, said to eternally cry when rain drips down its side. Hera doesn't appear in the myth's center, but you know she's there. She's in the lesson. Never insult a goddess, especially not her kin, especially not the one who spent 9 days in labor under a banishment. Hera may not have struck the blow, but the entire structure of the punishment carries her signature symbolic, generational, poetic. Historians still argue whether Niobe's story is about divine punishment, maternal pride, or the unpredictable fragility of life. But no one denies that the tale feels Hera-shaped. It's not about sudden fury, it's about a slow, pointed reminder of the social order and the danger of forgetting it. And that brings you to the strange place Hera occupies in myth. She doesn't often act alone. She doesn't need to. She steers the machine, presses the right levers, moves her pawns. Her vengeance is collaborative, embedded in a system she helped define. As you drift away from Niobe's stone form, forever mourning, forever silent, you find yourself wandering a temple built in Hera's honor. There are statues here too, carved from cool white marble. But these figures don't weep. They stand tall, imperious, crowned with diadems, robed in folds that suggest both modesty and menace. You notice something odd about the way people speak of Hera in these temples. Not with fear, exactly. More like caution. Respect tinged with the awareness that she is always listening, always remembering. That's another of her qualities. Hera doesn't forget. She files things away, words spoken at festivals, boasts made in the wrong season. She may wait decades, even centuries, but the judgment arrives eventually. And here's your quirky tidbit for the night. Some local cults believe that Hera herself went through phases like the moon. Maiden, matron, crone, that she wasn't always vengeful or always regal. Sometimes she renewed, softened, even blessed fertility. But in the myths, the version we inherit, she almost never gets that grace. She's locked in her most fearsome mask, maybe because storytellers needed her that way, maybe because history finds it easier to remember the queen when she's angry. So you drift now between two statues, one of Leto, serene and strong, and one of Hera, tall and unmoving, and between them Niobe, carved into the stone of mountains, caught forever between pride and punishment. The lesson lingers. You float now beneath a twin twilight sky, one tinted with silver, the other with bronze as you trail behind the divine footsteps of Artemis and Apollo. Just hours after the tragedy of Niobe, and although their bows have cooled and their arrows are still, the air still hums with consequence, because when you trace the edges of myth, you find Hera even in the aftermath, her presence like a watermark on every moral etched in grief. But tonight's drift leads you not to the children nor their mourning queen. It leads you back to Leto mother, exile, survivor, and the complicated ways Hera continues to shape her path, even after the twins have grown. Hera never truly lets Leto go. Despite her defeat, despite Leto giving birth on Delos, despite Artemis and Apollo becoming powerful, respected Olympians, Hera continues to poke at the edges of their story, sometimes directly, sometimes through silence, through absence, because Hera doesn't always need to curse you. Sometimes she just refuses to help. You find yourself now floating just above a rare moment in Leto's later mythic life. The children are grown. The journeying is over. And yet, Hera continues to exert her influence not with fire, but with denial. Leto, in her older years, tries to found a new temple in her honor, something modest, sacred, a place to be worshipped. But many cities turn her away. Why? Because Hera's name still carries weight, even unspoken. No one wants to offend the Queen of Olympus. Even silence becomes a weapon in Hera's long, deliberate campaign. And this is what makes Hera different from the other gods. She isn't just stormy or reactive, she's systemic, institutional. While Poseidon drowns cities and Zeus throws lightning like party favors, Hera shifts policy. She denies alliances. She uninvites you. Historians still argue whether Hera was modeled after real-world matriarchs, priestesses, or queens who controlled sacred rites, weddings, or property. Some believe she represents the original sovereign female deity whose image was eventually reframed through patriarchal storytelling. Others think she simply filled the narrative need for conflict, the god who says no. But whatever her origin, her power was undeniable. You pass now through a spring-fed valley, where once Leto, exhausted and aching, is said to have bathed after a long journey. In some versions of the myth, local peasants tried to drive her away from the waters, perhaps fearing Hera's wrath, perhaps under her influence, and Apollo, infuriated, turns them into frogs condemned to croak forever at the water's edge. It's a short, strange myth easily overlooked, but Hera's hand is in it, not because she spoke, but because she made others afraid to act. That's her reach. That's her legacy. And even now, you begin to understand something deeper. Hera's most persistent tool isn't thunder or transformation. It's atmosphere. She creates climates of suspicion, unease, protocol. You don't have to fear her, but you do, because everyone else does, and fear is contagious. You drift through Delphi next, where Apollo reigns as god of prophecy and light. His temple gleams, his followers chant, and yet, Hera's name is still spoken in soft tones even here, even in a place ruled by her husband's golden sun. And Artemis, she withdraws, deep into the forests. Among animals, among moonlight, she becomes untouchable, safe, perhaps, from Hera's direct ire, but still orbiting her memory. Even the goddess of independence was shaped by the queen of expectations. Here's your quirky detail. For tonight, some ancient sources say that Hera once tried to ban Artemis from marriage, not out of vengeance, but as a political move keeping her forever apart from dynastic power. Artemis embraced it, refused to marry, turned it into her identity. What was meant to limit her instead defined her. You smile at that. It's a pattern you've seen before. Hera tries to cage, and in resisting, others become what they were never supposed to be. Leto, the silent, Apollo, the bright, Artemis, the wild, and Hera, still in the background, still curating every interaction like a museum director who knows exactly which paintings should hang beside which. As you drift into sleep, you realize this isn't the story of a villain. It's the story of a system. And Hera, she's the goddess of how things are supposed to work, even when they don't. Now your thoughts drift slow and warm through dry olive groves and sun-baked stones, down winding goat paths in dusty lands where mortals once dared to think they could outwit the gods. And one such mortal clever, cursed, and perpetually punished was Sisyphus. But we've passed his boulder already. Tonight, we linger with another figure whose path grazed Hera's, perhaps too closely, the city of Troy. Yes, we're not quite at war yet, but the pieces are in motion. And if you listen closely, you can hear Hera tightening the strings. Remember that golden apple, the wedding, the snub, the judgment Hera didn't forget? She doesn't forget. And the judgment of Paris wasn't just a slap in the face, it was the first domino, because Paris didn't choose Hera, he chose Aphrodite, and Aphrodite gave him Helen. And Helen was already married. Hera could have let it go. She could have called a divine HR meeting, or simply rolled her eyes and cursed quietly into a chalice of nectar. But no, Hera took it personally. You hover now over a wind-swept Trojan plain, long before the ships arrive. The walls of the city are high. The people are at peace. Paris, handsome and unaware, struts with Helen on his arm like a man who thinks fate is a party game. You can feel Hera watching. Not openly, not yet, but present. She doesn't go to war immediately. She sows doubt, fosters alliances, shifts opinions on Olympus. The war isn't hers alone, it's everyone's. But Hera makes sure it's organized, structured, motivated by divine principle and her own vendetta. And that brings us to another key player, Thetis, the sea nymph, mother to Achilles, a goddess who once refused Zeus's advances, and therefore, oddly, someone Hera doesn't completely hate. In fact, Hera supported Thetis's marriage to a mortal Peleus, and it was at that wedding where the apple first appeared. The irony: Hera backed the marriage that kicked off the chain reaction, that led to her own grudge going global. Myths are tangled like that. Even she couldn't have predicted how many lives that one tossed fruit would ruin. But here's your quirky detail for the night. Some ancient sources say that Hera, when she realized what the apple had set in motion, laughed. Not a kind laugh, not even a triumphant one, but a soft, knowing chuckle, like someone watching a well-placed domino tip over, because now she had a reason, a war-sized reason. You float now beside the gathering storm. The Greeks are assembling, ships being built, spears being sharpened, and Hera. She's lobbying hard on Olympus. She wants the gods involved. She wants Troy punished, not just because Paris insulted her, but because the insult was allowed to stand. It was never corrected. Historians still argue about this, the role of divine politics in the Trojan War myths. Some say the gods represent human emotions magnified Hera, the embodiment of insulted pride. Others say the gods were late additions, ancient retcons, giving cosmic flair to otherwise human drama. But if you follow the thread, Hera is always there, tugging, guiding. She aligns herself with Athena, who also lost the apple contest. Now there are two goddesses with long memories and a shared enemy. Hera doesn't just start wars, she builds coalitions. That's how she works. Meanwhile, Paris continues to parade around. Helen smiles. The Trojan nobles murmur. And somewhere in the clouds, Hera narrows her eyes and files another complaint in the celestial ledger. You find yourself now beside Helen not as a temptress, but as a symbol. She isn't blamed in this version. She's drifting, caught in currents of fate stirred by gods too proud to forget. And you wonder, did Hera ever pity her? Maybe once. Maybe in a moment when even Hera, cold and ceremonial, remembered what it felt like to be claimed, passed, judged. But pity doesn't last in Olympus, not when reputations are at stake. And so, Hera leans in. She starts preparing for a war that will last 10 years, destroy kingdoms, and carve new stories into marble. All because she wasn't chosen. All because someone once handed a fruit to the wrong goddess. And Hera, she just wouldn't let it go. Now you drift deeper into the haze of bronze and prophecy, where battle drums haven't yet sounded, but armor is being polished all the same. Hera's hand is already guiding the winds, not with violence yet, but with pressure, whispers, promises, alignments. Because Hera knows the art of war isn't forged on battlefields alone, it's crafted in pettiness, pride, and pretext. Tonight, you find yourself floating above the divine war room, Mount Olympus itself. It doesn't look like a place of strategy. There are columns, gardens, ambrosia feasts, and plenty of lounging. But behind the calm lies calculation, and Hera is hard at work. She has chosen her side, the Greeks, not because they are particularly pious or noble, but because the Trojans harbored Paris, and Paris chose Aphrodite, and Aphrodite must not win. She doesn't go alone. Athena joins her. The goddess of wisdom and war, also snubbed in the apple incident, becomes Hera's co-strategist. Together, they form an alliance of discipline and vengeance, logic and legacy. You can almost see them in quiet corners of Olympus, mapping out influence like generals in marble robes. And who's on the Trojan side? Aphrodite, naturally. She supports Paris, her golden boy, and also, surprisingly, Apollo, who favors Hector and the city's piety. Even Artemis, in some versions, takes the Trojan side. The lines are drawn, but the field is still quiet. And then there's Zeus, king of the gods, father of the problem, and Hera's husband. He insists he will remain neutral, balanced, observant, but Hera knows better. She knows where his sympathies lie. He's got a soft spot for Troy, not out of affection, but admiration for their honor, their strength, their poetry. Hera can't have that. So she begins the long campaign to push Zeus off the fence. At first, it's subtle. Questions at dinner. "Isn't it strange," she might say, "how often mortals dishonor their vows these days?" A sigh, a look, a well-timed reference to Paris. She doesn't accuse, she implies, and Zeus, in typical fashion, pretends not to notice. But Hera keeps at it. Here's the quirky bit in one myth. Hera even borrows Aphrodite's magical girdle, essentially a divine belt of irresistible charm, and uses it to seduce Zeus into a nap mid-war, just to keep him from interfering when she wants to tilt the battlefield in the Greeks' favor. That's right, a war manipulated with a nap and a belt. You float beside them now in that moment, a mythic mountain meadow where the king of the gods snoozes, sprawled out on a soft cloud, snoring gently, while Hera leans over the edge of Olympus, sending support to the Greeks below like a fantasy football manager in full control. She doesn't fight, she directs. And her target's Paris, of course, but also the idea of Troy itself, a city built on the wrong decision, a monument to insult. Hera wants it gone, leveled, turned into a lesson, etched in smoldering brick. Historians still argue whether Hera's role in the Trojan War is overplayed by later poets who needed divine drama, or whether her involvement reflects the Greek understanding of long-term divine justice. Either way, she's there from the start. A background presence that quickly becomes central, not on the battlefield, but in every event that leads to it. And her tactics only escalate. She encourages the Greeks, fortifies them, sends signs, sometimes omens, sometimes subtle divine boosts like a sudden wind in the sails, or a stroke of luck in a duel, always indirect, always deniable. Meanwhile, you drift toward Troy. It's still whole, still proud. But the ground is beginning to shift. The gods are whispering. The people don't know it yet, but their fate is being sealed not by swords, but by an old grudge held by a goddess who simply cannot let it slide. And in the quiet between those moments, you realize something else. Hera's greatest victories often go unnoticed. Not because they're small, but because they don't look like action. They look like coincidence, a late messenger, a diverted ship, a commander with sudden doubts. You pass over the Greek ships now lined up, waiting, each sail a statement, each oar dipped in fate. And above it all, Hera watches, not gleeful, not gloating, just satisfied, because the war she wanted is now inevitable. And Hera? Hera never needed to throw a spear. She just had to make sure everyone else did. Now you drift low over the plains of Troy, the smell of churned earth and warm leather drifting upward as the first clinks of bronze armor echo across the morning haze. The Greeks have arrived, ships pulled ashore in neat, aggressive rows. Spears are sharpened, shields gleam, and high above it all, Hera smiles not with joy, but with quiet, grim satisfaction. Because the war is no longer a possibility, it's here. And now that the game has begun, Hera steps onto the board in earnest, not as a soldier, but as a queen astride a chariot drawn by peacocks. Yes, peacocks, large, majestic, shimmering with 100 eyes that never blink. You can almost hear them screech as her golden wheels roll across the sky, announcing her presence like a celestial drum roll. She rides into battle not to fight, but to orchestrate, to inspire, to correct. You find yourself hovering just behind her, passing through clouds streaked with the fire of divine intervention. Below, the Greeks are struggling. The Trojans, backed by Apollo and Aphrodite, are pressing hard. And Hera is not having it. This is when she takes one of her boldest steps yet. She goes to Zeus. And not to ask, to manipulate, because even though he claims neutrality, Hera knows his patterns, his pride, his flaws. She doesn't beg for support, she plays the long game. She flatters, distracts, seduces, and, in the most infamous myth of the war, she borrows that magical girdle again, Aphrodite's woven charm, laced with love and longing, and uses it to put Zeus to sleep. You float just above that scene. A high cliff in Mount Ida, a bed of wildflowers. Zeus reclines, wooed into drowsy bliss, while Hera turns his absence into opportunity. She signals to the Greeks. The gods watching from Olympus murmur. The war tips. Historians still debate whether this myth was meant to show Hera's cleverness or reinforce the idea that real power sometimes comes not from force, but from timing. Hera doesn't need to win the argument. She just needs to control the moment when no one else is watching. And when Zeus wakes chaos, but not before Hera gets what she wants, Greek momentum. You follow her now across the battlefield, not in body, but in influence. Wherever the Greeks rally, Hera's there, not always visible, but present in every sharp decision, every act of courage spurred on by divine favor. She doesn't fight herself, but her chosen champions feel her breath on their backs. She favors Diomedes, the fierce Argive warrior who dares to wound gods. With Athena's help, he charges through the Trojan lines like a spark through dry grass. Hera's influence pours into him not strength, exactly, but clarity, confidence. You see him glance skyward in brief moments between bloodshed, and Hera's eyes meet his. He nods. She vanishes into mist. This is how she works, not with grand proclamations, but with chosen moments. Here's your quirky tidbit of the night in one lesser-known version of the Iliad. Hera personally inspires Agamemnon with a dream, disguised as a messenger. In another, she takes the form of a mortal woman to rally troops who are starting to lose heart. A general, a widow, a nurse, whatever role fits, because Hera can play any part she wants as long as the outcome tilts her way. You pass over the battlefield again. The noise rises, then fades, spears clash, shields crack, men shout and die, and Hera watches. She's not there for gore, she's there for balance. This war, to her, is not savagery. It's justice. It's the inevitable result of a long-simmering insult, now finally reaching its conclusion. She doesn't take pleasure in the death, but she takes satisfaction in the order of it, the lesson, the structure. And as you drift upward again, rising above the smoke and fury, you see something else. Hera's war isn't just against Troy, it's against memory. She is writing something into the bones of myth itself, a story that says, I was wronged, and I did not forget. And the war will remember her. Now the smoke curls higher. The earth is scorched, bronze is bloodied, and the siege of Troy grinds forward in its long, dusty agony. But up in Olympus, the real battle is far quieter words behind clouds, shifting glances, alliances formed with raised eyebrows and broken oaths. Hera is not finished. If anything, her efforts are only getting more personal. Because Zeus has woken up. And he's not thrilled. You drift just above the summit of Mount Ida, where Zeus sits fuming, robe in a twist, thunderclouds coiling around his ankles. He knows Hera put him to sleep. He knows she tipped the balance, and now he wants to restore his order. But Hera, she doesn't back down, she doubles down. They argue, loudly, but not with raised voices with protocol, with sarcasm, with the kind of marital tension that could fracture continents. You imagine a divine couple's therapy session here would be more destructive than helpful. You meddled, Zeus says. You hesitated, Hera replies. And so the cycle continues. Zeus tries to retake control. Hera works around him. She can't directly defy his orders, not openly, but she can reinterpret them, which brings us to one of her strangest tricks yet. You drift now into the middle of a strange day on the battlefield. Hera's plan, distract Zeus again, but this time, Through sabotage by suggestion, she convinces Poseidon, god of the sea and Zeus's brother, no less, to lend a hand to the Greeks. Poseidon agrees, maybe because he enjoys irritating Zeus, or maybe because Troy was never his favorite city anyway. Either way, Hera gets her way, again. Poseidon rises from the surf, a titan crowned in foam and coral, and floods the battlefield with Greek morale. The Trojans reel, the Greeks rally, and Hera watches it unfold like a grand strategy game only she understands. But Zeus eventually notices, and when he does, he sends Iris, the rainbow messenger goddess, to order Poseidon to stand down. Hera sees it coming. She always does. And she shifts strategy once more, pulling back, regrouping, never giving Zeus enough reason to strike her outright, always staying just inside the lines of divine legality. Here's your quirky myth tidbit at one point. Hera even considers marrying off one of her daughters, Harmonia, to a mortal prince simply to secure a future grudge leverage. Mythology's version of power networking. You float now across the halls of Olympus, where the gods gather like politicians at a never-ending summit. Hera moves among them gracefully, but every step is calculated. She speaks kindly to Athena, coolly to Apollo, coldly to Aphrodite. The tension is not just about war, it's personal. Every side glance is laced with old wounds. Historians still argue whether Hera's actions during the war were about strategy or spite. Was she trying to restore cosmic order, or just playing out a vendetta in slow motion? Perhaps both. Perhaps that's what makes her so enduring. She's not evil. She's invested. Meanwhile, on the plains of Troy, 1,000 tiny pieces fall into place. You glide beside a Greek soldier who swears he felt a sudden gust at his back mid-charge. "The gods favor us," he mutters. A Trojan archer's bowstring snaps. A chariot wheel jams. These aren't miracles. These are Hera's fingertips on the thread of fate, gently tugging. And the gods begin to divide more clearly now. Team Hera Athena, Poseidon, even Hephaestus at times supporting the Greeks. And on the Trojan side, Aphrodite, Apollo, and Ares, the erratic god of war himself. It's not just a battle among mortals anymore. It's a full-blown divine rivalry. Hera relishes it. Not the bloodshed, not the noise, but the elegance of it. The symmetry. A war that began with a slight one apple. One judgment now fully flowering into a myth that will ripple for centuries. You find her now in her quiet temple atop Olympus, the air heavy with incense, the stone walls carved with scenes of weddings and wars. She's calm, regal, watching. Not because she's done, but because everything is going exactly as she planned. And somewhere on the battlefield, a soldier stumbles, a horse bolts, a hero falls, and no one blames Hera out loud. But everyone knows. Now you descend again slowly, gently, into the smoldering middle chapters of the Trojan War, where dust coats every surface and every breath feels like it might be your last. The war has dragged on for years now. Cities have burned. Heroes have risen and fallen. But still, Hera hasn't had enough. Because Paris still lives, and Aphrodite still smug, and Hera still holding that original insult like a carefully preserved tax document isn't done balancing the ledger. Tonight, you find yourself weaving through the web of Hera's next series of plots. These aren't big, flashy moments. Not yet. They're smaller moves, adjustments, little nudges in the direction of doom. Because Hera doesn't always smash her enemies. Sometimes she lets them slip. You drift beside Achilles now, the moody golden boy of the Greek camp. He's pouting, refusing to fight. Why? Because Agamemnon, king of the Greeks, insulted him by taking his war prize. And while that may seem like petty mortal squabbling, Hera sees opportunity, a moment of weakness that can be weaponized. She leans into Athena. Athena, who shares Hera's grudge. Together, they manipulate the currents of pride and rage like expert sailors catching the perfect wind. Hera whispers ideas. Athena delivers them. They guide mortals not with commands, but with inclination. Achilles stays angry. The Greeks begin to falter. The Trojans gain ground. And Hera watches, not with fear, but with precision. She's not panicked by a temporary loss. She's letting the story gather tension, letting Paris feel just comfortable enough to stop looking over his shoulder. But Hera's next plot, it's not aimed at Paris directly. Not yet. It's aimed at Achilles' best friend Patroclus. When Patroclus borrows Achilles' armor and charges into battle, pretending to be the sulking hero himself, Hera sees it unfold with measured anticipation. This is how you build tragedy, slowly, layer by layer. Patroclus dies. Hector, Prince of Troy, deals the fatal blow. And Hera seizes the moment. Because now Achilles will return to the fight, and he will return furious. You float beside her again, just above Olympus, where Hera calmly watches the flames of vengeance catch. She doesn't need to fan them. They'll burn just fine on their own. Here's your quirky myth nugget. Hera once tried to have Achilles protected from death by dipping him in the river Styx. Wait, no. That was Thetis. Hera wouldn't bother with that. Hera doesn't shield her pawns. She positions them and then lets the rules play out. Meanwhile, Hera continues her tactical interventions. A snapped chariot axle here. A sudden fog on the battlefield. A momentary failure of nerve. Each one so small, so explainable. And yet, when you string them together, they begin to look suspiciously like sabotage. You pass by Paris now, lounging in the shadows of Troy, still unaware that his days are numbered. He hasn't changed. Still beautiful. Still arrogant. Still under Aphrodite's wing. And Hera is waiting. Waiting for the right moment to remove him from the board. She doesn't strike without symbolism. She doesn't simply drop a thunderbolt. She waits for mortals to make their choices, to stumble toward her intended outcome. Because punishment for Hera isn't about swiftness. It's about fittingness. And that brings you to Helen. You hover beside her now, gazing from the walls of Troy. Half lost in memory, she's not the seductress the poets made her out to be. Not in this version. She's trapped in the same current as everyone else, drifting in a sea of divine pettiness, used as a symbol in a war that was never hers to begin with. Does Hera blame her, maybe? But not like she blames Paris, or Aphrodite, or Zeus. It always comes back to Zeus. Hera's vendetta, you begin to realize, isn't just horizontal against lovers and rivals. It's vertical, aiming squarely at the system that allows these slights to happen. The patriarchal pantheon, the divine old boys club. And if she has to break a city to make her point, so be it. You pass now through the Trojan palace, where omens abound. Priests mutter, fires flicker, a child cries, and above it all, the gods tighten the net. Hera isn't moving pieces anymore. She's waiting for them to fall. Now you descend into the final act of Hera's Trojan campaign, not in the form of a glorious final blow, but in the quiet tightening of loose ends. This isn't a goddess lashing out. It's one finishing the paperwork. The war is nearly done. Troy is burning. The Greeks, with divine aid and decade-worn rage, have breached the walls, spilled into courtyards, torched the libraries. It's chaos, screams, smoke, and at the center of it all, Hera watches like a judge presiding over a sentence that was handed down 10 years ago, maybe longer. You drift above the city in its last night, rooftops crumbling under the weight of fire and betrayal. The Trojan horse, that infamous bit of Greek trickery, has already been wheeled in. And no, Hera didn't build it. That was Odysseus. But Hera made it possible. She held the lines, kept the war alive, nudged the morale. She wore Paris and Troy down slowly. Methodically, Paris may have thought he was protected, but Hera always knew that even the prettiest cities fall. Especially when she's offended. You float now beside Aphrodite, shielding Paris in one of her few remaining acts of protection. But Hera has done her work. Paris is no longer a prince. He's a fugitive with fewer places to run. In many versions of the myth, he dies a quiet, unheroic death. No divine chariot, no final redemption. Just a man who made a bad decision and became a cautionary tale. Hera doesn't gloat. She doesn't need to. Her revenge isn't in spectacle. It's in the outcome. The apple is answered. The insult repaid. The city aligned with her rival is dust. That's her style. She doesn't scream victory. She lets history do it for her. And then there's Helen. Still beautiful, still tragically iconic. As Troy burns, the Greeks reclaim her. She's brought back to Menelaus, her original husband. Some say he raises his sword to kill her and is disarmed by her beauty. Others say he never intended to hurt her. Hera, she doesn't intervene. Her part is done. Helen was never the enemy, just the excuse. Now, you drift into the aftermath, the smoldering lull after Troy's fall. Here's your historical tidbit. Some sources say Hera helped plan the post-war sacrifices, a structured cleansing, not for cruelty's sake, but to restore divine balance. Hera isn't about cruelty. She's about closure. And that's what she seeks now. The Greeks, triumphant, begin their voyage home. And Hera, having seen the war through to her satisfaction, steps back. For a moment. For now. But gods never rest for long. You hover beside a shrine built in her name, new, fresh, a Greek offering of thanks, not for mercy, for victory. And that's how Hera is remembered, not as the goddess who protects, but the one who remembers, the one who delivers results. Your quirky final detail from this chapter in some myths. Hera restores certain Trojan survivors, Aeneas, for instance, not out of pity, but to prove she's more than vengeance, that she is, above all, the goddess of continuity, of what comes after. Because Hera knows empires rise, fall, and are forgotten, but memory that lasts, and Hera is memory, ritualized. You drift away now, the last flames of Troy flickering in your mind's eye. Hera doesn't wave goodbye. She doesn't need to. She's already on to the next thing. A marriage to bless, a promise to enforce, another small imbalance to correct. She didn't start the war, not really, but she did finish it. And Paris should have known. Now that the flames of Troy have faded into glowing embers, you find yourself floating across a very different scene, not a battlefield, but a banquet. Not spears and smoke, but music, laughter, and too much wine. It's a flashback, a rewind, because to understand Hera's lingering quiet satisfaction after the Trojan War, you have to return to the moment that started it all, the wedding of Peleus and Thetis. You land softly on the grass of Mount Pelion. The sky is clear, the gods are dressed to impress, and the mortal groom is trying very hard not to look nervous. You can smell roasted lamb and floral honey. Harps play something ancient. Thetis, the sea nymph bride, glows with oceanic grace, and somewhere, just outside the gathering, a goddess of discord sharpens her golden pen. Eris wasn't invited, and Eris, being Eris, responds by throwing the world's most expensive tantrum, a golden apple with 3 words inscribed, "To the fairest." It rolls into the center of the feast like a divine mic drop. And everything after that, Hera's grudge, Athena's fury, Aphrodite's promise, Paris's decision, Troy's downfall. All of it sparked by one snubbed guest and 3 goddesses with no chill. But tonight, as you watch the scene unfold in slow motion, you notice something. Hera doesn't grab the apple first. She waits. She expects to be given it. After all, she's the queen of the gods. Surely there's no competition. But when Paris chooses Aphrodite, what stings isn't just the loss, it's the surprise of it. Hera doesn't see herself as vain. She sees herself as entitled. Her beauty isn't decorative, it's political, institutional. The apple wasn't about vanity, it was about recognition. And when it's denied, something deep and ancient fractures. You float now through the banquet hall, rewinding the details. Hermes bringing the apple, Zeus refusing to judge, Paris being plucked from his goat-guarding gig on Mount Ida to become the world's most unfortunate beauty contest judge. Historians still argue whether this whole myth was a later addition, a clever poetic device to explain the cause of the Trojan War in mythic shorthand. But whether invented or evolved, the story stuck. Because humans understand one thing very well: petty revenge is eternal. And Hera, she's the goddess who keeps the receipts. Here's your quirky tidbit in some versions of the myth. Hera offers Paris power, kingship, dominion, wealth. Athena offers him wisdom and military success. Aphrodite offers him love, the most beautiful woman alive. And Paris, he picks romance? It's a decision made by a teenager. Really? And Hera never lets him forget it. You drift now above a flickering scene in the banquet's aftermath. Hera walking alone along the edge of the celebration, her face calm, her mind already spinning future consequences. She doesn't scream. She doesn't storm off. She simply recalibrates. Because Hera's true power isn't in beauty or even wrath, it's in planning. That wedding so full of promise, so filled with divine glitter becomes, in retrospect, the greatest prelude to vengeance ever staged. Hera doesn't need to stop the apple from rolling. She lets it, watches it, learns from it. And thus begins her lifelong feud with Troy. You pass now into the minds of the other gods that day. Some laughed, some muttered, most tried to stay neutral. But not Hera. Neutrality isn't her style. She believed she should have won, and that belief reshaped the mythic world for generations. And yet, there's something strangely comforting in it. Because Hera is constant, predictable, you know where she stands. You always know what she wants: order, recognition, control. She's not chaos. She's the answer to chaos. And if that answer includes a little scorched earth diplomacy, so be it. Now the wedding fades, the guests depart, the apple's ripple has only just begun, and Hera. She files it all away, with a calm smile. Now you float gently across the Aegean, over islands scattered like pearls in a twilight sea, toward a quiet truth often lost in the fire and poetry of war. Hera didn't just operate in Olympus and on battlefields. She also lived in the minds of mortals, in their prayers, their festivals, their whispered fears. She wasn't simply feared, she was honored, worshipped, and nowhere was that more visible than in the devotion of entire cities. Tonight, you find yourself descending upon one of those cities, Argos. Argos didn't just revere Hera, it built itself around her. Shrines, temples, processions, the very bones of the city hummed with her name. And unlike in the epics, where she's often painted as vengeful and cold, here she was something else entirely: protector, queen, anchor. You drift through the great Heraion, her sanctuary just outside the city. Stone pillars rise like tree trunks, whitewashed and worn, and at the center stands a statue not raging, not regal, but maternal. One hand extended, the other holding a scepter crowned with lilies. This is the other Hera, the one the poets often forget. Because Hera wasn't just the goddess of grudges. She was the goddess of marriage, of family, of structure. And structure meant everything in the ancient world. You pass by a wedding in progress, two mortals, their hands joined, eyes closed as they speak vows under her imagined gaze. The priest calls upon Hera to bless the union, not with romance, but with endurance, with patience, with accountability. That's the kind of love Hera represents, the kind that survives drought and argument, the kind that knows it's not always fair. Historians still debate whether Hera's worship predated her Olympian role. Some believe she began as a powerful pre-Greek fertility goddess, later recast into a queenly wife figure once Zeus became king. Others suggest her mythological personality was split on one hand, divine spouse, on the other, sovereign ruler in her own right. Either way, cities like Argos and Samos saw Hera not as a jealous footnote, but as a central force in the divine order. Here's your quirky cultural tidbit during the annual Hera festivals. Women ran races in her honor, wearing tunics cut above the knee, hair loose, feet bare. These weren't just games, they were rituals, embodied prayers. Hera watched over transitions, girl to woman, bride to wife, wife to mother. You pass through one such race now. Dust rises beneath running feet. Laughter rings out. No thunderbolts, no curses, just motion, breath, sunlight. It's peaceful here, grounded. A world where Hera doesn't need to punish because her presence is already known, respected. And then there's the flip side. You float now into another small city-state, less devout, less careful, a place where her temple is cracked and underused. The marriages here feel brittle. The rituals have grown sloppy, and there's a sense, just a whisper, that Hera might not be pleased. No disasters strike, no monsters appear, but you notice crops falter, wells dry, midwives report difficult births. It's not wrath, it's withdrawal. Hera doesn't destroy. She removes her favor. That's enough. In this way, Hera becomes almost ecological, her presence a kind of divine climate system. When she's honored, communities flourish. When neglected, things tilt. This is the Hera the ancient cities knew, the version that temples tried to preserve with incense, hymns, and carved ivory. Not the Hera of the epics, but the Hera of everyday life, the one who watched, measured, balanced. You drift now into a small home, late at night. A woman lights a clay lamp, kneels before a simple household altar. She mutters a quiet prayer not for passion, not for beauty, but for her husband to be kinder, for her children to grow safely, for the walls of her home to hold. And Hera hears, maybe not with action, but with memory. Because if Hera's myths teach anything, it's this: she sees everything, not always with rage, sometimes with recognition. And when mortals remember her, she remembers them. Now you drift further into Hera's quiet empire, not through temples or warfare, but through the things left behind. Symbols, offerings, echoes. Because Hera wasn't just present in myth, she was felt in objects, in animals, in the rituals of daily life. She left reminders of herself everywhere, and each one told a piece of the story. Tonight, you follow those symbols. You begin with the most famous, the peacock. You drift into a grove, lush and dappled with shade, and there it is, a peacock, tail spread, feathers shimmering with the colors of midnight and fire, its plume dotted with 100 iridescent eyes, each one blinking with the legacy of Argus, Hera's faithful, 100-eyed servant. Remember him, the one who guarded Io, who was lulled to sleep and slain by Hermes. Hera didn't just mourn him, she remembered him. She gathered his many eyes and set them into the tail of her sacred bird, not just as tribute, as statement. Even her animals carry history. The peacock is more than decoration. It's vigilance, watchfulness, and a reminder that if you think Hera isn't looking, she probably already saw. Then there's the cow. Yes, oddly tender for a goddess so often associated with fury. But cows, in Hera's world, are not humble farm animals. They are symbols of nourishment, maternal power, and ancient fertility. You float into one of her oldest sanctuaries, where a golden statue depicts her not with weapons, but with calm bovine eyes and broad, strong shoulders. Long before she became Zeus's wife, Hera may have been worshipped primarily as a fertility goddess. Some scholars believe her earliest cult images were horned part divine woman, part cosmic cow, not silly, sacred, powerful. Then there's the pomegranate. You glide now through a dusty storeroom of votive offerings, clay fruit placed at her altars, symbols of abundance and complicated union. The pomegranate appears again and again whole, halved, jeweled with seeds like drops of blood. It represents marriage, not the pretty part, the binding part, the forever part. And then there's the lily. Pure white, unassuming, but sacred to Hera. In one version of myth, the Milky Way is born from her, literally. When baby Heracles suckled too hard, she pulled away, and the spilt milk flew across the heavens, creating the galaxy. You pause on that image for a moment. Even the stars, it seems, weren't immune to her influence. Here's your quirky detail for the night in some local cults. Hera was worshipped through wooden carvings of simple domestic objects, spindles, combs, cooking tools, not because she was small, but because she oversaw the small. Every corner of life, every corner of a home was under her eye. She didn't just live in Olympus, she lived in kitchens, in cradles, in the space between two people deciding whether or not to speak. You pass through all of this peacock eyes, clay pomegranates, milk stars, and realize Hera's symbols weren't designed to explain her. They were designed to contain her, not to reduce her power, but to give mortals something to hold on to, a way to make the unknowable divine at least visible. And still, every one of her symbols carries two meanings. The peacock is beauty, but also surveillance. The cow is life, but also weight. The pomegranate is union, but also consequence. Hera's gifts always have edges. Now you pass into a quiet chamber, a woman's room, high in a Mycenaean palace. She places a carved ivory figurine on a small table. Hera, with a crown, just 3 inches tall, maybe less. She lights a bit of oil. She whispers a prayer, something about protection, something about promises. And Hera hears it. Not in volume, not in sacrifice, but in intention. Because Hera, for all her grandeur, never needed trumpets. She only needed to be remembered. And she was in feathers, in fruit, in firelight. Now the pace slows. You float gently across a twilight-hushed hillside, where myths feel thinner, stretched out like old parchment. The thunder of war has faded. No gods are storming Olympus. No cities are burning. This is a quieter part of Hera's story, not in temples or sky chariots, but in how she was written into the minds of poets and playwrights, always with the same brush, that of the jealous wife. It's the image most people remember, and tonight you're going to sit with it. You land in a shaded stone theater, ancient, cracked, empty, but if you listen closely, you can still hear the chorus droning lines written centuries ago. The actors speak of Hera with caution, sometimes disdain, the jealous queen, the eternal scold, the one who never forgives. That's how the playwrights told it, and after so many retellings, the audience believed it. But why? You float now into the mind of Euripides, or Sophocles, or some other long-gone Greek dramatist tapping his stylus. He needs conflict, tension. He has a hero, and every hero needs an obstacle, a threat, a divine antagonist. Enter Hera. Not because she's evil, but because she's available, convenient, a goddess who already has a reputation for grudges. She slips into the role easily. And just like that, Hera becomes the trope. The scorned woman. The nagging wife. The overreactor. Historians still argue whether this portrayal reflects genuine ancient attitudes toward marriage or whether it was just good drama, but either way, the damage stuck. Even as you drift through her shrines, where she's honored as a protector, a life-giver, a cosmic matriarch, you can still feel the tension. The way later generations seemed more comfortable turning her into a caricature, easier to understand, easier to dismiss. And yet she endures. Because Hera's image can be twisted but never erased. Here's your quirky cultural detail in some early Greek plays. The character of Hera was actually played not by an actor, but represented by a mask, fixed in expression. That mask, frowning, severe, it told the audience how to feel about her before she even spoke. You drift now between two myths, one where Hera curses a child into madness, another where she saves a woman in labor. They both exist, they both carry weight, and neither cancels out the other. Because Hera, like the human experience she so often mirrors, is contradictory. She is protection and punishment. She is dignity and pettiness. She is mother, monarch, manager, and yet never allowed to exist simply as herself. Always someone's wife, someone's rival, someone's warning. You pause beside a forgotten scroll in an Athenian library, one that dared to praise Hera not for her power, but for her endurance, for her role as the goddess of staying, of holding on, of not letting things slide. That's a kind of divinity, too. It's not glamorous, it's not exciting, but it's what gives society its structure. Marriage, oaths, boundaries, rules. Hera is the divine embodiment of the things most fragile in a chaotic world. And maybe that's why she's so often resented, because she reminds us that actions have consequences, that vows matter, that forgetting isn't always an option. You drift now into the late-night hush of a Roman villa, centuries after Greece's golden age. A small household shrine still bears her image, though now they call her Juno. Different name, same crown. And even as Rome reshapes her, the old tensions remain. Still the jealous queen. Still the goddess of honor. Still the one who watches the wedding vows and remembers if they're broken. Because if myths are mirrors, Hera is the one who refuses to blur the reflection. She holds the glass steady, and if you don't like what you see, that's on you. Now you find yourself wandering further off the beaten path of myth, where the stories become stranger, darker, and sometimes oddly hilarious. Because even Hera Regal, controlled, high-throned Hera sometimes wades into territory that feels more like an ancient fever dream than divine protocol. Tonight, your feet land in the middle of a Dionysian forest wild, overgrown, pulsing with music and wine fumes. And standing at the very edge of it all, looking vaguely horrified and deeply unamused, is Hera. She is not here for a good time. She is here for discipline. Because the god of wine, theater, and chaos Dionysus was never her favorite. Not by a long shot. You might remember Dionysus was born under odd circumstances. His mother, Semele, was incinerated by divine glory, thank you, Zeus, and baby Dionysus was sewn into Zeus's thigh for safekeeping. That alone would have earned Hera's side eye, but it didn't end there. Because Dionysus didn't just exist, he thrived, he traveled, he gathered followers, and everywhere he went, people laughed, danced, abandoned social roles. Chaos followed him like perfume. Hera hates chaos. So naturally, she tries to eliminate it. You drift through one of the lesser-known episodes, Hera, furious that yet another of Zeus's illegitimate children is gaining influence, decides to drive Dionysus mad, completely, gloriously, vine-wrapped, mad. He wanders the earth, raving, followed by satyrs and maenads who tear animals limb from limb in religious ecstasy. Here's the quirky bit. Some versions of the myth say that Hera's curse of madness is what made Dionysus who he is. Without her interference, he wouldn't have become the god of altered states. He was supposed to be a footnote. She turned him into a movement. Historians still argue whether Dionysus's madness was punishment or apotheosis was Hera trying to destroy him, or did she accidentally launch his entire cult? Either way, her attempt at control led to more disorder. And Hera, ever dignified, has no choice but to sit back and watch the toga-wrapped chaos unfold. But she doesn't stop there. You drift into another fragment of myth, one where Hera tries to block Dionysus from ever being recognized as a full Olympian. She argues with Zeus. She questions his lineage. She insists that wine, while fun at parties, does not warrant divine status. Eventually, Zeus wins as usual, and Dionysus is given his golden chair on Olympus. But Hera never fully embraces him. Even seated at the same eternal banquet, she eyes him warily as if he might, at any moment, replace the honeyed figs with fermented goat milk and start a conga line. You linger beside one of their more awkward interactions during the festival season. The Greeks held Dionysius celebrations of drama and revelry, and Hera's temples were often quiet during these times, not because she wasn't important, but because nobody wants a goddess of order crashing their wine-fueled street parade. Still, Hera endures. Because no matter how loud the party gets, someone has to clean it up. Someone has to remember what was promised, what was broken, what consequences still hang in the air. You glide past a strange little altar now half-cracked, laced with ivy. It bears both Dionysus's thyrsus and Hera's scepter. No one really knows who built it, but its presence tells a story of conflict, of coexistence, of the eternal tension between rule and release. Hera is not warm, she is not spontaneous, but she is necessary. Because without her, the stories have no boundaries, and without boundaries, even Dionysus has no contrast. This is the role Hera plays in every myth she touches, even the bizarre ones. She doesn't just punish, she defines. She forces the narrative to confront its own limits. And Dionysus, he may never have thanked her, but his story owes her everything. Because without Hera chasing him from town to town, he might never have become a god at all. Now you drift into stranger waters, still into stories that don't always make it into the schoolroom versions, the polite retellings, or the dusty museum plaques. These are the myths where things get slippery, twisted, a little too strange to be comfortable. And as always, Hera is there watching, intervening, correcting the narrative as best she can. You touch down in a quiet grove at the edge of an ancient polis. The trees are unnaturally still. In the distance, a serpent slithers through the grass, not fast, not dangerous, just present, and nearby. A mortal man stares at it a little too long. That man is Tiresias. And this story, this is Hera at her most complicated. The tale begins innocently enough. Tiresias, walking through the woods, comes upon two snakes mating. In one version, he strikes them apart. In another, he simply observes. Either way, the result is mythological madness. He is transformed into a woman. Entirely. Completely. For 7 years. You float beside him, or rather, her as Tiresias adapts, lives as a woman, marries, becomes a priestess of Hera, experiences the world from a new angle. This isn't a punishment. Exactly. It's a shift, a divine experiment in perspective. And then 7 years later, Tiresias encounters the snakes again. He repeats the act, and the spell is reversed. He's a man again. All might have ended there, except for one divine dinner party dispute. Zeus and Hera are arguing, again. This time, about who experiences more pleasure in love, men or women. Zeus says women do, Hera says absolutely not. And both turn to Tiresias, the only mortal to have lived on both sides of the experience. Tiresias, brave or foolish, agrees with Zeus. And Hera blinds him. Just bam, mortal sight gone. No thunder, no fanfare, just quiet, irreversible darkness. But Zeus, feeling guilty and maybe a little smug, grants Tiresias the gift of prophecy to compensate. And so, the blind seer of Thebes is born wise, grim, respected, and permanently marked by a spat between husband and wife. Historians still debate the meaning of this story. Was it about gender knowledge, the danger of speaking truth to power, or was it simply one more cautionary tale about getting involved in divine business? Whatever the answer, Hera's role in the myth stands out, not just for the punishment, but for the principle. She's not reacting to cruelty. She's reacting to being contradicted, publicly, by someone she once protected. Because Hera's loyalty runs deep, but so does her demand for respect. When it's broken, even by a former priestess turned prophet, she responds swiftly and symbolically. Here's your quirky detail in some versions of the myth. Hera didn't blind Tiresias out of rage, but out of necessity. The truth he spoke was forbidden knowledge, too dangerous to let a mortal keep. The punishment wasn't personal, it was policy. You drift now through the city of Thebes, where Tiresias would one day predict downfall after downfall. Oedipus, Creon, Antigone, always the one to say the thing no one wants to hear. And Hera, she never speaks to him again, at least, not directly. But her silence is just as telling. You pass through more myths with a similar flavor. Hera as the enforcer, Hera as the corrector. One man mocks her temples, he ends up transformed. One queen boasts too loudly, her sons are struck down. It's not always dramatic. Often it's subtle. But the message is the same. You don't cross Hera and walk away unchanged. And then there's the story of Anemone. A woman wandering in a drought-struck land, searching for water. She's assaulted by a satyr. Hera sends Poseidon to rescue her. But of course, he falls in love. Myths being myths, it's messy. But in the end, Poseidon gives her a spring of water, and the land is saved. Why does Hera allow this? Because the result serves her goals, order restored, balance returned, mortals reminded of divine structure. You float above that spring now, still flowing, still sacred, and Hera's presence lingers not in wrath, but in resolution. Because not all her interventions end in tragedy. Sometimes she just redirects the story. Now you rise slowly into the daylight of worship, where myth steps back and ritual takes over, where the gods are less characters in a drama and more forces woven into daily life. And Hera, who's long been the stern figure in the background of stories, emerges here as something else entirely divine: patron, high queen, keeper of sacred spaces. You drift above Olympia, not the stadium, not the racing tracks, but the sanctuary on the hillside, before Zeus ever claimed his thunderous temple. There was Hera's, older, simpler, built of stone and wood, and standing like a quiet matron beside the younger, flashier gods. It's the Heraion, and it's one of the oldest temples in Greece. And here, Hera isn't myth, she's presence. You float into the sanctuary. The columns are uneven, some Doric, some warped with age, but the reverence is palpable. Inside, there once stood her statue, perhaps of ivory, perhaps of marble no longer angry, not crowned with peacock feathers or lifting a scepter, but seated, calm, watching, waiting. You watch as a procession approaches young women in simple white robes, weaving through olive groves with baskets of offerings. These are the Hera, ancient games held in her honor. Not for men, for girls, runners, maidens, not quite myth, not quite history, something in between. The race is short barefoot across the stadium where, decades later, Olympians would compete for Zeus. But this came first. Hera's race, Hera's ritual. And in that moment, she isn't the jealous goddess. She's the matron of becoming, of the line between girl and woman, of endurance. Here's your curious cultural detail. The prize for winning the Hera wasn't gold or glory, it was meat. A portion of Hera's sacred cow. Practical, symbolic, nourishing. Because Hera's gifts aren't flashy, they're foundational. You pass through a wedding now, a mortal one, simple and solemn. A bride stands before a hearth, holding a pomegranate, whispering Hera's name not for passion or lust, but for structure, for the bones of the home, the rhythm of shared days. In ancient oaths, Hera is invoked not to begin love, but to preserve it. Historians point out that marriage in ancient Greece was transactional, even strategic. But to the people in it, it was also sacred, and Hera's presence gave it weight. You drift now through a smaller temple on the island of Samos, one of her oldest cult centers. They say Hera was born here, or at least worshipped here, long before Olympus was organized. The priestesses here knew her not as Zeus's wife, but as the mother of order, of law, of ritual. In Samos, she was called Hera Teleia, Hera the completer, not the beginner, the one who sees things through. You can almost feel the shift how mythology reduces her to rage, but worship raises her to reverence. In stories, she lashes out. In sanctuaries, she sustains. And maybe both are true. Because Hera's divinity isn't in kindness, it's in clarity. She is the moment when the ceremony begins. The contract is signed. The feast ends, and the real life begins. You don't go to Hera for a flirtation. You go to Hera for permanence. You watch as a woman middle-aged, tired, steady lights a candle before Hera's image. No fanfare, no poetry, just gratitude, a long marriage, children grown, a roof that held. She doesn't ask for more. She just thanks the goddess who made it endure. That's Hera's quiet power. Not in lightning, not in wine, but in the days that hold their shape. Now you drift into the wide, quiet chamber of Hera's mythic resume, where the names of her roles and titles settle like dust on carved marble. Not the explosive goddess of jealousy you've followed through flames and feasts, but the full mosaic of who she is: wife, queen, avenger, enforcer, mother, not always in the nurturing sense, but in the structuring sense, the one who lays the foundation, even as she tightens the rules. You hover now above a painted ceiling from an ancient temple. Each panel shows a different face of Hera. In one, she stands beside Zeus, tall and stately, head slightly tilted as if listening, not to him, but to the 1,000 obligations crowding her divine calendar. In another, she blesses a wedding. In another still, she turns her face away from a woman in childbirth, one she has chosen not to help. Because Hera chooses, always. She is not a goddess of automatic generosity. Her favor is earned, or negotiated, or withheld. You float down beside her throne on Olympus, not Zeus's lightning-scorched perch, but her own. It's carved with lilies and lions, symbols of beauty and power. She sits straight, composed. Nothing in her posture asks for affection, but everything in her presence demands acknowledgement. And that's what Hera craves more than anything. Not praise, not love, but recognition. She wants to be seen, not just as Zeus's wife, not just as a scorned woman, but as a goddess in her own right with dominion over oaths, over marriage, over the sacred thread of continuity that binds mortal lives together. You pass now through stories that tried and sometimes failed to explore that complexity. In one, Hera offers help to Jason and the Argonauts, but only after he proves respectful at a roadside shrine. In another, she supports certain cities, like Argos and Mycenae, because they worship her correctly. Not extravagantly, just with structure, with care. Historians still argue whether Hera's image suffered from the way myths were written, usually by men. For male audiences, maybe the myths shaped her into a bitter obstacle because strong, rule-enforcing women made better foils than heroes. Or maybe Hera's contradictions just reflect those of the society that made her. Here's your quirky tidbit for the night in some local cults. Hera was honored in 3 forms: child, bride, and widow. Not as a literal biography, but as a life cycle. She didn't just rule marriage, she ruled its beginnings, its duties, and even its endings. The full arc, the whole contract. You pause now beside a sculpture in a ruined temple courtyard. Weather-worn, faceless, but unmistakably Hera. The artist didn't give her a smile. Just a posture that says, "I see you." And you understand finally that Hera isn't meant to make you comfortable. She's not here for bedtime stories. She's here for truths. That loyalty hurts. That power isolates. That no vow is sacred without something or someone who remembers it. You think back to every time Hera said no. To Zeus, to mortals, to fate. It wasn't bitterness, it was boundary. And that is perhaps her most overlooked divinity. She doesn't forgive easily because she values promises too much to pretend they're weightless. She doesn't forget slights because she understands that memory is the mortar between history's stones. And Hera, she's the one who keeps the temple standing. Now you drift across a library of the mind, dusty, slow, pages crinkling beneath your thoughts as scholars old and new continue to argue about Hera, not in temples or myths, but in books, in footnotes, in quiet offices lined with shelves and softly ticking clocks. Because Hera, more than most Olympians, refuses to be pinned down by any single definition. She is not just character, she is debate. You hover beside a scroll half unrolled on a wooden table. On it, a scholar from centuries ago is mid-argument: is Hera a villain, a victim, or just misunderstood? You see the outlines of 3 camps. First, the classical traditionalists. They see Hera exactly as the myths present her: jealous, controlling, resentful, a necessary obstacle in the stories of greater heroes. She exists, they argue, to reflect the trials of power, the sting of betrayal, the fury of a woman trapped in divine patriarchy. She isn't kind, but she's consistent. They point to Hercules, to Io, to Semele, case closed. Then, the revisionists. They argue that Hera has been maligned, that she was once a powerful mother goddess, a sovereign protector of the earth and its cycles, later reduced by patriarchal narratives into a shrew. They note that her oldest temples predate Zeus's rise to supremacy, that her name may have once meant season or earth, that in early cults she was worshipped alone. Her role as Zeus's wife came after. And then there are the symbolic interpreters. They treat Hera not as a person, but a principle. She is law, she is order, she is the divine reflection of structure, especially domestic structure. Where Zeus represents chaos, storm, appetite, Hera is consequence, ritual, expectation. The tension between them isn't marital, it's mythic. A blueprint of human nature in divine form. You linger among these theories, feeling the pull of all 3. None are wrong. All are incomplete. And then, the arguments start to ripple outward into culture. Modern writers try to reclaim her. Some frame her as the original feminist deity, one who refused to smile sweetly, while her husband cheated his way through mythology. Others say she's too vengeful, too unforgiving, too hard to love, but maybe that's the point. Hera was never built to be lovable. She was built to be respected. Here's your fringe detail in one academic debate. Hera was compared to a legal contract, not a person, a principle, a binding force that has no emotion but immense consequence. You may not adore a contract, but break it, and you'll feel its wrath. You drift into a college seminar room. Students debate whether Hera's portrayal in modern media films, novels, video games is fair. Most admit she's often sidelined. Others argue she's one of the only gods who acts like a god, distant, powerful, morally ambiguous. And all the while, Hera's myths sit in the center, waiting, still. You return now to the stories, to the time she tried to stop Hercules at birth, to the way she outwitted Zeus in matters of law and sky, to the slow, measured way she watched Troy burn. And none of those acts are easily filed away as good or bad. They are acts of someone playing the long game, of someone who believes, above all else, that rules matter, that justice matters, that memory matters. So while scholars still argue, and myths still spin, Hera remains unmoved, not silenced, just unread by those who expect warmth when they should be looking for weight. She isn't here to comfort you. She's here to remind you that power, once given, must be carried. And Hera, she's been carrying it since before the gods had names. Now, in the final stretch of this long, measured drift through myth and memory, you return to Hera, not the fire starter, not the queen on her throne, not even the name whispered before weddings, but to the presence that endures when all the storytelling stops. You're no longer chasing plot. You're not sifting through mortals cursed or cities burned. You're simply resting in the echo that Hera leaves behind. You float above the world, not Olympus, not Argos, not Troy, but a timeless space, a twilight-colored ether of recollection, where the gods fade into archetype, where Hera becomes not a figure, but a feeling. And the feeling is weight. She's not light or soft or whimsical. Hera is the goddess of what stays, not what starts, of what holds firm when chaos threatens to unmake things, of every rule you agree to but don't always want to follow. She is the promise that binds, the consequence that waits, the gaze that never leaves you even when you've forgotten why she's watching. And she is watching. You feel her now not in fire or thunder, but in balance, in structure, in the dull thud of footsteps down a temple aisle, in the whisper of a vow made under breath, in the pause before you speak, knowing your words may echo for years. And Hera remembers every one of them. You float through her myths again, not as events, but as themes, control, reverence, retaliation, a goddess who never forgets, a deity who defends tradition, even when it hurts. She is the one who says, "You don't get to break things and walk away." She is not forgiving, but she is fair, at least on her own terms. Here's your last quirky note in some versions of the oldest myths. Hera doesn't rage against her rivals. She simply refuses to acknowledge them, turns her head, withdraws her favor, and in doing so, they fade, forgotten by the divine record. Hera's silence, it turns out, is sometimes more powerful than her wrath. And so you drift now toward silence. The stories have been told. The gods have had their feasts and feuds. The wars are over. The temples are crumbled or converted. And yet Hera remains etched into marble, inscribed on rings, whispered in ceremonies that no longer know her name. And in that quiet endurance, she achieves something rare. For a myth, she transcends it. She is no longer just the wife of Zeus, or the queen of the gods, or the eternal antagonist of some guy with nice biceps and parental trauma. She is memory itself, bound into ritual, coded into law, baked into the way humans remember things that matter. You linger at the threshold now, almost asleep, her presence folding over you like a stone cloak. The world is full of gods, but Hera is the one who stays. So now, as the myths grow dim, and your breathing slows, and your blanket folds a little heavier against your chest, let Hera slip from goddess to metaphor. Let her step quietly from her throne and walk, without sound, into the long hallway of the mind where ideas sleep. Imagine her pausing at the door to your thoughts, not to scold, not to punish, just to ensure things are in place, that your memories are in order, that your heart, even if tired or tangled, is still tethered to something meaningful. She doesn't tuck you in. That's not her way, but she closes the window, checks the latch, ensures the night is held. Because sleep, too, is a kind of structure. You're no longer walking through myths now. You're floating inside them. Hera is no longer a face or a name. She's the sensation that things have meaning, even if they're difficult. She's the idea that not everything must be soft, to be sacred, that boundaries are beautiful, that remembering matters. And so, you exhale. The gods are quiet. The torches are out. The crown is resting gently on a stone pillow beside a still, cold altar. And Hera, she stays, just a little longer, watching, not to judge but to witness. Because if no one remembers, it never really happened. But Hera always remembers. Sweet dreams,